fertilizer plays another role now. A
Right.
lot of that, the way I understand it, it comes in from Canada, different countries like that. What are we doing to bolster domestic fertilizer production?
A lot of it does come in from Canada, and so we'll end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to. We can all do that here, but I would say what you do, you put very severe tariffs on from coming into other countries. You'll be making your own fertilizer very soon.
In fact,
Most Americans never think twice about where their daily bread comes from or their evening pasta. Making a sandwich feels routine, almost automatic. Boiling a pot of spaghetti, the same. But behind that simple loaf of bread lies a complex, multi-billion-dollar international story, one that is currently being rewritten in a way that could change the American kitchen forever. Canada controls 90% of United States wheat imports. The U.S. produces roughly 50 million tons of wheat annually, mostly lower protein winter wheat.
But that trade relationship that once was a great strength has now become a serious vulnerability. Now, I want to be clear. Canada still has the best deal of any U.S. trading partner, with 85% of our trade with the United States remaining tariff-free and the lowest average tariff rate in the world.
This is fine for some things, but it's not enough for the high-quality products Americans love. For the perfect bite in pasta, you need something specific. For the structure needed for premium bread, you need something even more specialized. You need high-protein spring wheat and durum. This is where Canada comes in. But the Canadian prairies, specifically Saskatchewan and Manitoba, produce spring wheat with 14% protein content and specific gluten characteristics that American soil simply cannot replicate. It's not just a matter of preference. It's chemistry and geography working together in a way that can't be easily duplicated.
Did you know that Canada produces some of the highest quality wheat in the whole world, packed with fiber, B vitamins, minerals, and iron?
The soil composition in Saskatchewan is different. The growing season is shorter, but more intense. The temperature swings between day and night create stress on the wheat plant. Stress that actually increases protein development. American farmers have tried to replicate these conditions. They've failed. You can't manufacture geography, you can't engineer climate, and you can't force soil that's been developing for 10,000 years to suddenly produce different characteristics for generations. American flour mills, especially those in the north, have been built specifically around the unique qualities of Canadian grain. Their machinery is calibrated for it. Their quality control labs are designed for it. Their entire supply chain depends on it. It isn't just a partnership. It is a critical dependency. These mills invested billions of dollars in infrastructure based on one assumption that Canadian wheat would always be available, always be affordable, and always flow freely across the border.
I think we will go backwards. It's an endless cycle that we're caught in right now, and this is all I know. Can't do it any better.
Some of these mills have been operating for over 100 years, family businesses passed down through 4, 5, sometimes 6 generations, all built on the same foundation, Canadian wheat. That assumption, it's shattered in early 2025. Invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and citing national security concerns, President Trump announced a sweeping 25% tariff on all Canadian wheat imports, 25% overnight. The logic in Washington was simple, if aggressive.
25% on most goods, 10% on energy. Trump's 30-day pause issued last month was supposedly to give Canada time to address Washington's concerns about the border. But Trump said Monday afternoon there was no room left to negotiate a reprieve, and at that moment, markets shuddered.
They believed they held all the cards. The administration assumed that Canada's wheat industry was so dependent on the American market that they would have no choice but to cave to U.S. demands. Demands that included lowering dairy tariffs, scrapping digital services taxes, and submitting to American trade priorities. Trump treated wheat as a negotiable commodity, something he could leverage to force a win. The goal was to make Canadian wheat prohibitively expensive, forcing American mills to buy homegrown grain. But the administration missed a crucial detail. American mills didn't just want Canadian wheat, they needed it. There was no domestic alternative that could match the quality or quantity required. None.
And over the course of all of that time, that was the rare breakthrough of emotion that we heard from him. Like most farmers, usually he tries to put on a brave face, but he said he wanted to be honest about how difficult the situation really is because he wants others to know that they're not struggling alone.
And this created a problem that Washington hadn't fully anticipated. Because when you make something essential prohibitively expensive, you don't just hurt your opponent, you hurt yourself. American mills were now facing a choice they never wanted to make: pay the tariff and pass the cost to consumers or shut down. There was no third option, no magical supply of high-protein spring wheat waiting in American silos, no secret stockpile that could bridge the gap, just a tariff and the consequences it would bring. The day the tariff was announced, grain traders in Chicago knew exactly what was coming. Futures markets went haywire. Wheat prices spiked 23% in a single trading session.
The trade war is now on, Adrian. Donald Trump's tariffs are in effect. After months of threats and shifting demands, the U.S. president followed through. These sweeping and devastating tariffs upend one of the most productive trading relationships in the world, punishing America's closest economic partners.
Flour mill executives held emergency board meetings. Supply chain managers scrambled to lock in contracts before the tariff took effect. And across the American heartland, farmers watched in confusion as the policy meant to help them actually made their situation worse. And this is the moment the trade war stopped being political and started showing up in your grocery cart. While Washington waited for a surrender, Canada chose a different path. Under the leadership of Mark Carney, Canada refused to beg for exemptions.
I know that a lot of Canadians are asking themselves what is going on right now.
Despite all Canadian efforts to fend off tariffs, officials spent much of the day waiting to find out what was next.
As of this moment, I have no news to report on that front.
There's been no word like today, no? Not to my knowledge, no.
We don't know what's coming tomorrow. I'm not even sure if President Trump knows what's coming tomorrow.
In a now famous speech at the Canadian Club in Toronto, Carney declared, "The decades-long process of ever closer economic relationship with the United States is over. Our economic strategy is to change rapidly." This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a total pivot of the Canadian economy. Carney didn't just retaliate with counter tariffs. He weaponized the wheat itself. He realized that while the U.S. is a large market, it isn't the only market. Canada had built relationships with dozens of countries over the past decade, and now was the time to use them. Canada immediately began redirecting its wheat to countries that actually wanted to buy it. Mexico, China, Brazil, Indonesia, the Philippines. Countries that didn't slap tariffs on essential food imports. Countries that understood the value of a reliable trading partner. Within weeks, Canadian grain elevators were reconfiguring their logistics. Trains that used to head south were now heading west to Vancouver and Prince Rupert. Port facilities that had been underutilized for years were suddenly running at full capacity. Shipping containers that once carried Canadian wheat to American mills were now bound for Shanghai, Jakarta, and São Paulo. In a highly symbolic move, Carney attended a ceremony in Mexico City with the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway to celebrate the arrival of a unit train carrying Manitoba wheat. The message was devastatingly clear. Canadian wheat was now using American rail infrastructure as a land bridge to bypass U.S. buyers and deliver product to Mexico instead. Think about that for a moment. Canadian grain was literally rolling through American territory on its way to somewhere else. The very infrastructure built to connect these two economies was now being used to route around American buyers entirely. It was a visual representation of what happens when you weaponize food security. The wheat didn't disappear, it just found new buyers, and those new buyers were more than happy to pay market rates without the political games. China, facing its own food security challenges, signed a 3-year contract for 12 million tons. Mexico, eager to diversify away from U.S. dependence, committed to 8 million tons annually. Brazil, looking to supplement its own wheat production, locked in 5 million tons. These weren't small orders. These were structural shifts in global grain trade. And every ton going to Asia or Latin America was a ton not available to American buyers. Back in the United States, the impact was immediate and painful. For American flour mills, the 25% tariff added $196 million in costs overnight. That's the kind of money that wipes out profit margins and jobs instantly. A company importing $5 million worth of wheat suddenly found itself owing an extra $1.2 million in taxes, $1.2 million, just like that. Because there were no domestic alternatives for high-protein wheat, millers had two choices: pay the tariff and pass the cost to consumers, or shut down. They passed the costs. Flour prices in the U.S. surged by 11% in early 2025, 11% in a matter of weeks. Bread became more expensive at Walmart. Pasta lost its signature bite because manufacturers were forced to use lower-quality substitutes, and families across the country began to feel the squeeze at the checkout counter. But it wasn't just about the price of a loaf of bread. The ripple effects spread throughout the entire food industry. Bakeries that had operated on thin margins for decades suddenly found themselves unable to compete. Small pasta manufacturers closed their doors. Restaurant owners watched their food costs spike, forcing them to raise menu prices or cut portions. Pizza shops in New York that had used the same flour for generations were now scrambling to find alternatives that didn't compromise their product. Bagel makers in Montreal, ironically, on the Canadian side, were shipping their products south, where American competitors were struggling with inferior wheat. The competitive advantage had flipped overnight, and the American food industry was paying the price. In Minnesota, a fourth-generation flour mill announced it was closing after 92 years in business. The owner, a man in his 60s who had worked in that mill since he was 16, gave an interview to the local paper. He said they'd survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and multiple recessions, but they couldn't survive losing access to Canadian wheat. The machinery they'd invested in over decades was calibrated specifically for Canadian grain. Retooling would cost millions, money they didn't have, so they shut down. 43 people lost their jobs, a community lost a cornerstone business, and the American economy lost another small piece of its industrial base. This story repeated itself across the upper Midwest. Mills in North Dakota, Montana, and Michigan faced the same impossible choice. Some shut down, some limped along, bleeding money while hoping the tariff would be lifted. None of them won. The situation only escalated. By April 2025, the U.S. had expanded its trade war, imposing a 10% global tariff and even higher reciprocal tariffs on dozens of countries. Corn futures volatility on the Chicago Board of Trade surged by 15%, and U.S. farmer incomes began to collapse as retaliatory measures from Canada, Mexico, and China closed off export markets for American corn and soybeans. American farmers found themselves caught in the crossfire. They had nothing to do with the wheat tariff decision, but they paid the price when their traditional export market slammed shut in retaliation. Soybean farmers in Iowa watched Chinese buyers disappear. Corn producers in Nebraska saw Mexican orders evaporate. The very people the administration claimed to be protecting were the ones suffering the most. And here's the cruelest irony. American wheat farmers, the ones who were supposed to benefit from the tariff, didn't see the windfall Washington promised because American mills didn't want their wheat. They needed the Canadian variety, so American wheat sat in silos while Canadian wheat sailed to Asia. American farmers lost export markets due to retaliation, and American consumers paid more for bread. Nobody won, except maybe Canada's new trading partners. Farm foreclosures in the Midwest increased by 18% in the first quarter of 2025. Rural banks heavily exposed to agricultural loans started reporting higher default rates. Equipment dealers saw sales plummet as farmers delayed purchasing new machinery. The economic pain radiated outward from the farms into entire rural communities. Main Street businesses in small towns across Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska felt the pinch. When farmers don't have money, they don't spend money. And when they don't spend money, local economies contract. Hardware stores, diners, farm supply shops all saw revenues decline. This is what happens when you treat agriculture like a political chess piece instead of the backbone of rural America. What started as a trade tactic has turned into a permanent restructuring of the global grain trade. Canada has proven it has options. While the U.S. imports 90% of its wheat from Canada, Canada only exports about 20% of its wheat to the U.S. 20%. The dependency runs north to south, not south to north. This is the detail that Washington fundamentally miscalculated. They assumed Canada needed the American market more than America needed Canadian wheat. The numbers tell a different story. Canada ships wheat to over 60 countries. 60. The United States is important, but it's not irreplaceable. For American mills, however, Canadian wheat is irreplaceable. Canada has now signed 15 free trade agreements covering 51 countries, representing over 60% of global GDP. They are sending 2 million tons of wheat to Indonesia, 1.5 million to the Philippines, and massive quantities to China and the Middle East. These aren't temporary deals made in desperation. These are long-term partnerships being built while the U.S. market sits on the sidelines. Mark Carney's goal is to double non-U.S. exports by 2035. By threatening the hand that feeds them, the U.S. didn't just raise the price of bread. They incentivized their closest ally to stop being a partner and start being a global competitor. And here's what makes this permanent. Infrastructure follows trade, and trade follows trust. Once Canada builds out port facilities to ship grain to Asia, those facilities don't just disappear when a tariff gets lifted. Once they establish quality control systems for European buyers, those systems become the new standard. Once they cultivate relationships with Mexican importers, those relationships develop their own momentum. The wheat that used to flow south by default now has multiple destinations. American buyers will have to compete for it, and competition means higher prices. Even if the tariff disappears tomorrow, even if Washington reverses course completely, the damage is structural now, not political. Canada is currently investing $4.7 billion in port infrastructure on the Pacific coast, new grain terminals, enhanced railway connections, expanded storage facilities, all designed to move wheat west instead of south. This infrastructure will be operational for 50 years, maybe longer. That's 2 generations of Canadian wheat flowing to Asia instead of America. 2 generations of American mills scrambling for supply. 2 generations of higher prices for American consumers. Let's talk about what this means for the average American family. Because this isn't just about trade statistics or diplomatic posturing. It's about your grocery bill. A family of 4 that used to spend $70 a week on groceries is now spending $77. That's an extra $364 a year just on bread, pasta, and baked goods. For a single mother working 2 jobs, that's a car payment. For a retiree on a fixed income, that's a month of medication. For a young couple trying to save for a house, that's their down payment slipping further away. And the price increases aren't stopping at wheat, because when you disrupt one major commodity, you disrupt the entire supply chain. Eggs cost more because chicken feed uses wheat. Beef costs more because cattle feed uses grain. Even beer costs more because barley is caught in the same trade turbulence. The tariff on Canadian wheat became a tax on the American dinner table. And unlike income taxes, this one hits hardest on the people who can least afford it, because the wealthy can absorb an extra 10% on their grocery bill. The middle class notices it, but the working poor, they feel it in every meal. Food banks across the country reported a 32% increase in demand during the first quarter of 2025. Families that had never needed assistance before were suddenly lining up for help. Teachers in elementary schools noticed more kids coming to class hungry because when the grocery budget gets squeezed, sometimes breakfast gets skipped. Nutritionists started seeing patterns in their practices. Patients switching to cheaper, less healthy options because whole wheat bread was now a luxury item. This is the human cost of using food as a weapon. It doesn't show up in trade deficit calculations. It doesn't appear in diplomatic cables, but it's real, and it's happening in communities across America right now. There's another dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed. Food security isn't just about having enough calories. It's about having access to the right nutrition. Whole wheat bread, fortified pasta, high-fiber cereals, these aren't luxury items. They're staples of a healthy diet, especially for children. When prices spike, families don't just eat less, they eat worse. They switch from whole wheat to white bread because it's 50 cents cheaper. They buy boxed mac and cheese instead of whole grain pasta. They cut fresh vegetables to make room in the budget for the basics. Nutritionists call this the poverty diet paradox. When healthy food becomes expensive, low-income families shift to cheaper, calorie-dense, nutrient-poor alternatives. And the long-term health consequences, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, end up costing society far more than the original savings. So, when we talk about the wheat war, we're not just talking about economics. We're talking about public health. We're talking about childhood development. We're talking about the hidden costs that won't show up for another decade, but will be devastating when they do. A study from the University of Michigan projected that the shift away from whole grain products could lead to a 14% increase in childhood obesity rates over the next 10 years. That's hundreds of thousands of kids facing health problems that could have been prevented. Medical costs for treating diet-related illnesses could increase by $12 billion annually. Productivity losses from a less healthy workforce could reach $20 billion, all because a tariff made healthy food less accessible. The National Institutes of Health issued a quiet warning in March 2025. They noted that dietary quality in low-income households had declined measurably since the wheat tariff took effect. Fiber intake was down, refined carbohydrate consumption was up. The nutritional foundation of American children was being eroded not by choice, but by economic necessity. This is what happens when you treat food policy as an afterthought, when you assume that market forces will solve everything, when you ignore the fact that for millions of Americans, an extra $7 a week isn't trivial. It's the difference between nutritious meals and empty calories. The wheat war of 2025 serves as a stark reminder. Food security is not something you gamble with. The U.S. administration thought they could use a specialized essential crop as a blunt instrument for political leverage. Instead, they exposed America's vulnerability and disrupted their own food industry. As the harvest continues in the Canadian prairies, 36 million tons of wheat are shipping out to 60 different countries. But less and less of it is heading south. Canada has learned that it can thrive without its neighbors' approval, leaving the United States to explain to its citizens why a tough trade policy was worth a permanent crisis in the bread aisle. In modern economies, food isn't leverage, it's infrastructure, and breaking infrastructure breaks trust. Trust once broken takes generations to rebuild. Trade routes once redirected rarely flow back to their original channels. Markets once lost must be won back at a premium. The United States didn't just lose a trade battle, it lost credibility as a reliable partner. And in the global marketplace, credibility is currency. Canada's wheat is now feeding Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. American mills are paying more for less. American consumers are footing the bill, and the architects of this policy are left explaining why winning the argument was worth losing the war. History will likely look back on the wheat war of 2025 as a case study in unintended consequences. How a policy designed to strengthen America's negotiating position actually weakened its food security. How an attempt to pressure an ally ended up creating a competitor. How short-term political thinking produced long-term economic damage. The lesson is clear. Even if uncomfortable, in a globalized economy, no country is truly independent, not even the United States. Interdependence isn't weakness. It's reality. And pretending otherwise doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you vulnerable in ways you didn't anticipate. Before we close, one quick clarification. Everything in this video is based on public information, historical context, and my own analysis.